Okay, it looks like 8:20. Looks like don't see anybody else trying to get in, so we'll go ahead and get going. Welcome to day 2 of our MS4 forum, the first session on grants. So, like to start by saying that I know you heard it probably in every session yesterday, and you'll hear it some more today, but I know you haven't heard it yet today. So, we just want to remind you that throughout today, the presentations and information offered as part of this MS4 forum are the views and experiences of the organizations presenting. EPA and the Pennsylvania DEP do not endorse any one approach or funding strategy. The views and the opinions expressed by the speakers and the speakers' organizations are their own and do not reflect those of the EPA or Pennsylvania DEP. Mention of any commercial enterprise, product, or publication does not indicate an EPA or Pennsylvania DEP endorsement. Okay, I also like to thank our speakers. So we've gathered this forum to develop this to focus on the permittees' experiences as they work to meet their conditions of the Pennsylvania MS4 permit. So all of our speakers yesterday and today have volunteered to share their information in an effort to serve as a learning opportunity for their fellow permittees and local decision makers. So start by thanking our speaker today, Ellen. Who's going to tell you a little bit more about grant opportunities. So, Ellen, if you'd like to, I guess you've already introduced yourself, but if you'd like to briefly do it again and take it away.
Great. Thanks very much, Jason. Yes, my name is Ellen Kohler. I'm the Program Director of Water Resources at the University of Maryland's Environmental Finance Center. I know this is the third time, but we serve all of EPA's Region 3. I have been working in Pennsylvania with MS4 permittees for the last 6-7 years. A lot of my projects have been supporting multi-municipal collaborations and supporting those collaborations and individual municipalities in developing financing strategies to support their stormwater programs. So a couple of slides you've already seen, but just for the folks who haven't been with us yet to talk about financing, when we work with communities, we think about how we're going to match up the activities that they need to pursue with the partners that would be good for them to work with and the revenue streams that they have available. These are going to always look different. But when you're thinking about this in the grant, like the combination is always going to be different for each community. But when you're thinking about these things with respect to grants, you want to think about which one of these activities are best funded with grant dollars, and which partners might be able to help you access some grant funding that you're interested in getting. There might be some grant programs where it's better, say, to have a watershed organization submit the grant application. Or maybe it's a program where you've submitted an application in the past and it would look better if you weren't applying again, because they might think, the grant organization might think, oh, well, we've already given that that municipality some grant funding. So, partnering can be really important in terms of looking at grant funding and how you're going to access it. If you're going to apply yourself as a municipality, you need to make sure you have that kind of grant writing capacity within your municipality. And if you don't have it directly in your municipality, can you access it? Is it something that, for example, maybe there is that capacity at the county level and you are able to work with the county to help with that grant writing and accessing those dollars. So when you're thinking about these activities and the partners and the revenue streams, you do need to, in the grant context, there are some very specific questions you want to be asking yourself and making sure you're ready and able to access those dollars. And you've seen this chart before, and we're going to talk specifically about the grant element here. As I said before, most of the PRPs that I've reviewed in Pennsylvania mention that they're going to rely on general funds and grants. And that makes a lot of sense, particularly for communities that have not been in the MS4 permit program before and are just starting to stand up a stormwater management program. But it does mean that there are a lot of communities out there that want to access grant funding, which means that those grant programs are going to be very competitive. And you're not going to be able to fund everything with grant funding. It can be incredibly catalytic to start a program, to implement a demonstration, that kind of funding. implement a demonstration project, say at your municipal building, where the community might see it and go, oh, that's really interesting. Oh, we're managing stormwater, and be more supportive of the work that you need to do for the rest of your permit. I will say, in terms of grant funding, as we talked about a little bit yesterday, we need to be aware that most grant programs do not pay only for operations and maintenance. This is a challenge because we know that operations and maintenance is so important in terms of maintaining that the functionality of those stormwater facilities, and particularly green stormwater infrastructure. What I'd love to see is if we can push those funders to at least support operations and maintenance for green stormwater infrastructure in those first 5 years, so that you get those plants well established and that facility is actually functioning the way it's supposed to function. So we'd love to, push that. It's a good idea for you as a community, when you're planning those kinds of projects, to put those expenses in that project budget right from the start, so that you're thinking about managing and budgeting that way. As we say here, the grant dollars can be a great source for shovel-ready projects, for demonstration projects. We need to keep in mind that grant funding is not guaranteed, right? You can submit a grant and you might not be successful. So what's your backup? What's your plan B if that grant doesn't come through? And as I mentioned, it's not the best source for long-term funding of your stormwater program. In terms of grants, when we look at this visual, and you think about your stormwater facilities, grants can be really helpful in terms of acquisition. We know that they're not going to be great in terms of helping support this maintenance over the long run. But you need to think about the timing of that grant program and whether it's going to fit with when you want to put in this BMP at the beginning. So, for example, there was a bunch of grant programs that were open this spring. So the applications were due in April, for example, but the money might not come in until August or September. Well, fall can be a great time to plant if you're going to do green stormwater infrastructure BMP. But if you don't get all of that lined up before December, you might have to put off planting until the spring. Does that work? Is that okay in terms of the capacity that you have within your municipality to do that project in the spring instead of the fall? Those are the kinds of things you need to think about in terms of the timing of grant funding. You don't have as much control over it as you do of other resources. And it can be just spurts at one time of the year and not consistently over time. So you do need to think about the timing of when grant revenues can come in. Okay, let's talk about some different kinds of grant resources. I think you guys are probably familiar with some of these, but maybe not with all of them. You can find grant funding, and we are going to talk at the end a little bit about loans. You can find grant funding at the federal, state, and local level. There's the state revolving fund resources. Most of those come in the form of loans, but there are some grants for communities that are resource challenged. There are some great sources through the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and we'll talk about a few specific examples. There's some great resources at the state level, and then you want to be thinking creatively, not just the ones that are specifically designated for stormwater management, that it's so clearly that's what they're targeting. Think creatively about how you can use some of these resources that might seem a little bit more outside the normal box for stormwater, but are very much aligned with implementing green stormwater infrastructure as a community amenity, for example, or for helping to manage flooding in terms of hazard mitigation. And there might be some really interesting local sources for grant funding. There's a program in Chester County that some of the municipalities that I work with can access as a result of a landfill that went in, and there had to be a settlement because of some violations there, but it has created a source of funding for those communities to access for environmental projects. So think about federal, state, and local level. And if you're looking at the federal level, here are some things to think about that might not be in the normal, in your normal course of work. So FEMA at the federal level and also at the state level, the Pennsylvania Emergency Management agency has funding now for pre-disaster dollars, okay? And it's through this program called Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities. So these funds can be used to implement projects that are going to help manage flooding so that it doesn't have, so you're not having to go back to FEMA after a storm event. So these are can be some really great resources. This is a relatively new program. We aren't entirely sure how much of it's going to be able to hit the ground, in what kind of communities, but it's something to be thinking about and to be partnering with the folks doing your hazard mitigation in your municipality to access those dollars. There's also, through the U.S. Department of Agriculture, both this Regional Conservation Partnership Program and Urban Community Forestry Program dollars. These can be great resources to work with individual landowners, but also on municipal lands. Obviously the Urban Community Forestry Program is targeted at planting trees. That can very much align potentially with the kinds of work you might want to do for your stormwater management, say along riparian buffers. And the Regional Conservation Partnership Program often works in the context of a watershed-wide plan, and that can help you work with private landowners through partners that can, that might be working directly with those landowners to implement some BMPs on their properties, but then you're going to realize some stormwater pollution reduction from those projects. At the state level, there are some really interesting programs through the Commonwealth Financing Authority, and a bunch of communities access these programs for some of the work they need to do for their drinking water and wastewater systems. But they are also available, these funds are also available for your stormwater systems. And it can be both your gray and your green elements of your stormwater system. So you might want to be thinking about, how can I access some of these funds for those purposes? Again, these programs are very competitive, but I do think that both the Commonwealth Financing Authority and PennVest are very interested in trying to help communities address their stormwater needs. And so I think it's a great idea to start submitting applications to these programs for stormwater management. So the H2OPA program is funded through state gaming and tourism revenues. And these are going to be, as you can see, larger projects, 500,000 to 20 million for those kinds of larger projects. The PA Small Water and Sewer Fund, which comes from the fiscal code, is going to be for smaller projects, but there can be some really great things that you can do, including lots of different kinds of stormwater basin retrofits that fit in that bucket, right? That are about that kind of a size need in terms of implementing. And then the Act 13 dollars that come from Marcellus shale gas impact fees. This is a really interesting resource to be looking at, those restoration and watershed restoration and protection projects that you might be thinking about in your communities, and how to access some additional resources. If you have a stream restoration project that is well planned, so that you've already managed the upstream flow that's coming into that area and attenuated that flow, so that once you implement that stream restoration project, it's going to hold and work for you in the long run. This program could be a great source for helping support that restoration project. Flood mitigation as well. This you need to be on a particular, there's a sort of a list that the Corps has, but it might be an important program to look at and see if you've got a project that should get on that list and be eligible for that funding. I hope that you all are familiar with the Dirt and Gravel Low Volume Road Program in your communities. This is a program that's managed through your conservation district. It may not seem like the best fit for the work that you need to do on your stormwater permit, but it can be actually really interesting how some municipalities have used it. Westchester Borough used this to implement pervious pavement on alleys because they're not, that fits in the low volume element of this program. They're not more than 500 vehicle trips on those alleys per day, and so they were able to use that funding source to do that work. There might be some road stream crossings that are within your urbanized area. You can use these dollars to address those road stream crossings and put in a new road stream crossing that is going to better manage the water coming off of the road and entering into the stream, as well as also create a better fish passage in the stream itself. So think about how you can be using these resources in your community, and it can be whether you're a borough or a township, and can be even in an area where you have higher density of development. In addition, the kinds of environmentally sensitive management projects that you would put in to manage runoff for these dirt and gravel road projects are the same kind of BMPs you could put in any place to manage runoff on your road system. So that's another way to use this program, is to learn more about what you can do to manage runoff in any place in your municipality for implementing BMPs along the road. You also want to be thinking about how you can work with partners. And this is a project that it's not within the Chesapeake Bay, but it's in Chester County. There, obviously, on the left-hand side, we've got some, showing an area where we've got some pretty significant stream bank erosion. And here's what it looks like afterwards. We want to think broadly about who you're going to be partnering with and how they can help you meet your stormwater goals. This is private property, right? But this is a very meaningful project in terms of the impacts and the reduction in sediment that occurred. This is on Plum Run, and it was implemented by the Brandywine Red Clay Alliance, a watershed group in the area, in partnership with the Chester County Conservation District. There are 4 separate parts of the project that were implemented over 5 years. It was almost a mile of stream, all on private property and a private golf course, not a municipally run golf course. They did a bunch of different kinds of, there are a bunch of different elements to the project, including in-stream structures and planting a bunch of trees. They did manage the upstream urban runoff, and it did have, they were addressing some legacy sediments. They got funding from Growing Greener, from a foundation, Tree Vitalize, a total cost of $1 million, and the municipality didn't pay a thing. Everything happened on private land, and as long as you've got that agreement in place and can show it's going to be maintained, the municipality can use this project in its MS4 permit as one of the projects that was implemented and reducing sediment loading. Okay, I'm going to turn to Penvest now and chat a little bit about loan funding. Penvest, like I said before, is trying really hard to get some dollars out on the ground to support municipalities in addressing their stormwater management needs. So these are 3 different ways that Penvest is looking to support municipalities and hoping that it'll be very meaningful in the stormwater setting. They now have a programmatic financing strategy, which would help communities fund, and it doesn't have to be stormwater, but since we're talking about that today, where they will fund a capital improvement plan or some element of a plan, either in whole or in part. So they'll commit to pay for a group of projects as long as each project or each phase of the project is eligible for SRF funding. So that would give you a reliable source of funding over multiple years, and know that then you would know as a municipality that you will have the resources you need to complete all the projects that you have planned, say, in your PRP, and not have to implement them all at one time. So a steady source of funding to be able to implement a range of projects over time. The second program is the sub-level revolving fund. This would be at a regional basis. So this would be maybe to support a multi-municipal collaboration on a watershed or a county basis. The loan would come to that community or that regional entity, say maybe a county or an economic development corporation, and they would manage how that money gets distributed in the community. You wouldn't be applying to Penvest, then you'd be applying, within your community, and all Penvest wants back is that principal plus 1% at the end of the loan period. So this sub-level revolving fund would create a lot of flexibility at the community level to be able to work together and figure out where the best places are to implement projects and be able to do it in a way that's really cost effective. I mean, 1% is is really cheap money. And I do, while your communities may not be in love with the idea of going into debt to finance stormwater, at 1%, that's pretty economical in terms of having a source of reliable funding to meet your permit needs. And as I said before, you don't have to, that loan doesn't have to be guaranteed with a stormwater fee. It can be through general fund dollars. Finally, I want to mention the small project initiative, which is loan funding again, but up to $500,000. This can be done in an expedited basis, so you don't have to wait for a PennVest board meeting to approve the project. There are some, requirements here that it's for smaller communities and projects that have, if you're looking at a wastewater facility or a drinking facility that have a smaller number of hookups. But it's just important to keep in mind that it might be a good source of funding for a particular project where you don't quite have those resources in place on an annual basis, but you could pay the loan back through your general fund dollars. So that's what I have to talk about in terms of grants. I should circle back and just mention that there are some other grant resources, some grant programs that I'm hoping you guys all know about through the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation's Chesapeake Bay program, excuse me, and also through the Chesapeake Bay Trust. That's the G3 program, the Green Streets, Green Jobs, Green Cities. And those two resources are, they're more commonly known about. That's why I didn't cover them. I was trying to cover stuff that maybe you hadn't been thinking about. But certainly we can talk about those. Both of those generally are open in the spring. So they just both just closed their RFPs in April. So something to think about in terms of timing is those become available in the spring. I don't know how many folks we have joining us, but I thought it might be interesting if you're willing to, if you wanted to put in the chat, if you've accessed grant funding, what kind of grant funding you've accessed, what program to support your stormwater work that you're doing in your municipality. So if you're willing to do that, go ahead and stick that in the chat and we can open up to questions. Yeah, you will get a copy of all the presentations. I think that'll become available. I'm seeing that in the chat. Those will become available after the forum is done.
Ellen sits quiet. This is Ben Thomas from Cumberland Township, Adams County. I just want to thank you for an excellent presentation.
I couldn't quite hear that. If you want to try again, or maybe type your question, if it was a question, if you wanted to type that in the chat, that'd be great. Oh, okay, thank you. So nobody in the group here has accessed any grant funding, or are we just, is everybody just not quite awake and willing to enter in NFWF? Okay, great. NFWF is the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation grants. We have worked with communities using those grants in a technical assistance setting. So there are a couple of different programs. There's a small pot of money that's up to $50,000 for small planning grants, and we've worked with several communities using those dollars from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. But then there's a bigger pot of money that's for implementation. And those dollars can be, I think, up to $500,000 over 2 to 3 years in that bucket. So that can be some pretty meaningful resources if you have a set of projects that you want to implement and you can meet, and those projects align well with their programmatic goals. Those programmatic goals look at things like fish and wildlife, interests, and that's actually something I should circle back to. I want you all to remember that in the context of your MS4 program and the permit that you're working on, that permit is geared towards making sure the waterways that we have near our municipalities have good aquatic life habitat. And this particular permit cycle is focusing on sediment, nitrogen, and phosphorus within the system and the impacts those pollutants have on aquatic life. But in the long term, what we want is a healthy fish environment. So keep that in mind in terms of your overall stormwater program. That's your target, not a sediment reduction. Okay, you might achieve your sediment reduction, but if there's something else that's impacting that aquatic life in your stream, there's going to be more work that's going to need to be done. So it's really important to take that longer term perspective of we want healthy fish habitat in this stream. And that is the focus of this NIFWIF program. And so that's actually it's really good because if it gets you in that mindset of thinking about, we got to make sure this is a good place for fish to live, which, by the way, if it's a good place for fish to live, it's pretty darn clean. And it also means it's a good place for us to swim and probably a good source of drinking water. If you have that mindset in terms of what we're trying to achieve in terms of water quality in our streams, I think that's going to serve you better in the long run than only focusing on what's in this particular permit to check a permit box. So that's the other thing I wanted to emphasize, and I've tried to emphasize in my other two presentations, is make sure that you're using your MS4 permit to the extent that you can to achieve other community goals that you have in your community, whether it's putting in a new park, addressing road runoff, or maybe trying to address a flooding issue that you have in your community.
Okay, are there any other questions for Ellen?
I mean, I could ramble on if you want me to, but I don't think anybody needs to listen to me. This is the third time you've had to hear from me, so I don't think you need to listen to me anymore.
Yeah, we have about 3 minutes left in our session, so
okay.
A few more minutes to have Ellen as a resource if you have any questions for her.
And feel free to reach out to me individually as well. We're happy to touch base with municipalities and address any specific questions you might have.
This is Stacy Locastro. I'm actually from Southern Alleghenies Planning and Development Commission. And kind of here on two sides, one my work aspect and one on my personal aspect, because my daughter is in a soccer club in Altoona, Hollidaysburg area. And kind of a question I have is soccer fields, because we have a couple soccer fields in our soccer club. And a couple of them have issues because of streams and or the Juniata, little Juniata River flooding, constant flooding issues. And so, some of the things that I've looked into researching when the club has a couple of those fields that they own and or have options on leases or looking on long-term leases, have issues with constant flooding or drainage issues. One of them they just recently got was the Haas's soccer complex over in Hollidaysburg. And of course, 2 years ago, we of course had those terrible floods over in Hollidaysburg, and the field was completely underwater. But the little Juniata is a constant issue of flooding and has been for many years. Even when I was growing up, I lived by the little Juniata and experienced many issues of flooding. Yeah. So that was one of the things that I've been looking at, and they're looking at possibly another land that is around some swamp, I guess, or in a 30-year floodplain area. So that's kind of one of my interests, is how to work with or maybe mitigate some of those issues that could possibly help the soccer club as I'm on my side life writing some grants for them.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, so to get some soccer fields, because the reason why they're not looking at the Hosses field as much to do some turf, possibly fields for the soccer club that to be more a prominent soccer club is because of those issues. And when
Yeah.
some of the land that they can possibly get, they can't get is because of these issues.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it is a challenge. You know, you do want to be able to attenuate that upstream flow if you want to be able to use the fields. I will say that many communities do think of, you know, their park areas and an open area like that as being a good place for floodwaters to go because it's, you know, it's better than it going into somebody's house.
Right.
So yeah, using playing fields as a, you know, more or less a part of your stormwater facility is not uncommon, but it does make it a little challenging to then use it for soccer. So you do want to have a situation if you're going to have playing fields where you can have good drainage and be able to use them again when those flood waters recede. But yeah, so floodplain reconnection is a really big, it's a great way to be addressing both flood issues and stormwater management. And so if there was a place upstream to do a little more reconnection with that floodplain and a little more storage, that sounds like it might be, you know, beneficial in the long run to maybe allowing those fields to be used a little more often for playing soccer. But, you know, we're going to see, I think we all know we got to reassess where our floodplains are because our flooding events are different than they used to be.
All right. Thanks for that. Great question.
Yeah.
So I think we're at the end here. We can can wrap up. I think you can continue. If you have a few more questions for Ellen, you can drop those in the chat and we can try to get to them right before the next session. So our next intro section will start at 8:55. So I think, again, you've heard this a few times, but you want to leave this session, go back to the agenda, and then click the link there to join the Pennsylvania DEP. Jamie Eberl will be talking first about developing pollution reduction plans, and then from there we'll break out into 2 sessions. But Jamie will tell you all about that. So we'll see you all over there.
Great. Thanks, Jason.
Thank you, Ellen.